appreciate your participation in this. It's so important as we work to advance racial equity that we look inside our own sector, the nonprofit sector, which, as you will hear today, we have a great deal of work to do. And I'm very happy to welcome all of you to begin the journey that we're all on to advance racial equity in the nonprofit sector. So this event will be recorded and the PowerPoint will be distributed. There are, everybody on this event, on this Zoom, is important. So I'm not going to run through and do acknowledgements of everyone, just to know we all are important because we all have a significant part to play. So whether you're here from business, government, or nonprofit, it's important that we begin this process together. So thank you so much for coming. I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and recommend that for this process, you may want to, for this event, you may want to put yourself in speaker view at a certain point so you can hear the speakers as well. So here we are. And as I said, I'm going to be introducing Anahita Codefal, our president and CEO of Lifting Up Westchester, in a few minutes. Our mission and our members are really the backbone of this organization. And every member is significant. You enrich us with your work and what you do. So we thank you for having the confidence in us and for supporting us. And a special thank you to our executive committee and board of directors for all that you've done to sustain our organization. Also, a special thanks to those businesses and funders that choose to invest with us. We appreciate it as well. Today has been is the culmination of an incredible journey with 5 really exceptional people that have worked so hard and done so much work in this process. So I thank you, Sean Thomas Breitfeld from the Building Movement Project, Karen Cheeks-Lomax from My Sister's Place, Maria Imperial from the YWCA, White Plains and Central Westchester, Damon Kelly from Lutheran Social Services of New York, and Theo Oshiro from Make the Road New York. You've put so much work into this, and I really, really am grateful on behalf of NPW. To our sponsors, United Way, YWCA, and Westchester Library System, thank you so much for your financial support. It means a lot, and we're very appreciative. I invite all of you to find out more about the 21-day Racial Equity Challenge and to sign up. From what I understand, this too is an incredible journey. Again, the series of programs that the Y is launching, thank you. And thank you to Westchester County government for making the process of planning this center possible. Here is our agenda for the day, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank the 3, in addition to our panelists, the 3 facilitators who will be joining us: Kimberly McNair from My Sister's Place, Ariana Quinones from the Y, and Jeanette Gisbert from Volunteer New York. And now I am going to hand this over to Anahita Codefal to give greetings. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this continued discussion on obviously a very important topic to our members, but to society as a whole. I wanted to, and I should start by saying that my remarks only reflect my views and not those of the whole NPW Board of Directors, because I think we all know that when it comes to issues of race and equity, you know, we all have very different perspectives depending on where we sit and what our life experiences are. But as we talk about the work that our sector needs to do, and I think some of the information you're going to hear is going to hurt your feelings because some of it's surprising. I found it very interesting, and that I feel like it parallels my own learning process really in the last year since the George Floyd incident and the uprising nationally. And I think it's sort of the awakening of people who thought we were the good guys. And I think when, I certainly have always thought that I was not a racist. And I think that and I still think that, and in my professional career, and I worked in both the private sector and in the public sector, I've certainly been a person who has even been what I would call transactionally anti-racist, meaning, I was the EEO officer and I investigated complaints and I righted wrongs and I did equity analyses and made sure people were paid equally, and I increased diversity and I sponsored women and all of those things. But I don't think I realized until last summer that I was not actively anti-racist at a macro level. And I think we're going to learn more about what that looks like today, but I think the same is true for our sector. We've always been satisfied that we're the good guys, that our values were equity and inclusion driven. We've hired minorities, we've righted wrongs in communities, we've served, and we haven't really, but that's transactional. And so that was really sort of what would be expected from people who are not racist. But it's not the same as, undermining and, breaking down the underpinnings of racism and power structures that our institutions are also part of because of how we were created, who our boards are, how money and power exists in the county, how money is important to nonprofit missions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would just sort of start the conversation by saying, it doesn't make us bad people, but we have a lot of work to do even in our own sector. And I think given that many of us, myself included, have always thought that we should be setting the standard, and we're setting the standard. If we want to continue to do that, I think we have a lot of work to do structurally to change the way, our leadership works and change the composition of who we are, not only at the senior level, but in how decisions are made and people are promoted and how we treat our clients and really pretty much every other aspect of what we do. So I just want to put that out there, at least as far as I'm looking at my own record, and just encourage everyone to come to this conversation without feeling defensive, but really just thinking more about what else is being asked of us if we don't want to be having the same conversation a decade from now. So with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful panelists, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Anahita. And now we're going to have a presentation by Sean Thomas Breitfeld on the Race to Lead survey revisited. Sean, it's all yours.
All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen so that you all can see the slides that I prepared to share with you the findings of our Race to Lead survey and the Race to Lead revisited report that we released last year. So as was said earlier, my name is Sean Thomas Breitfeld. I'm co-director of the Building Movement Project, and BMP is an organization that's been around for about 20 years. And for the past 5 to 6 years, we've been particularly focused on issues of race and leadership in the nonprofit sector. Before that, we had done work on generational leadership tensions, as well as looking at how direct service organizations can do more to support and uplift the voice and power of the communities and constituencies they serve. And then also looking at how organizations that support, how organizations can support movements and can collaborate to build bigger movements for impact and change in our society. So to talk about the survey specifically, we first launched this body of research in 2016 with a survey of nonprofit employees from across the country. And our goal at the time was to get 2,000 people to participate in the survey, and we met that threshold very early on. So we just doubled our goal. And we ended up with over 4,000 people participating in the survey effort, which made for, at the time, a very big data set. Certainly the biggest one that we knew of, looking specifically at issues of race and leadership in the nonprofit sector. And so that then led to a series of reports that you can check out on our website, both Building Movement, the Building Movement webpage, as well as a satellite site that we created, racetolead.org. And so in 2019, we resurveyed. And we added some new questions because we wanted to start exploring some of the real organizational interventions and practices that may be leading to more equity, potentially, in organizations, and to understand some of the organizational dynamics in more detail for a race equity assessment that we're building. And so this time in 2019, we ended up with more than 5,000 nonprofit staff participating. And so what I'll do first is talk to you about the demographics of the sample, and then I'm going to go into the findings. And so, as I said, we surveyed in 2016 more than 4,000 participants. In 2019, over 5,000 participants. And this map is just showing you where we had, the darker the color, it represents the more respondents. And not surprisingly, California, Texas, New York, big states, big populations. As a result, we had more respondents from those places as well. And what was interesting was, even though, you know, we know that the respondents, some respondents to the 2019 survey also responded to the survey in 2016. We also know that this is not a longitudinal study. And so it's every time we survey, it's a different point in time. Nonetheless, the samples in 2016 and 2019 were remarkably similar in a lot of ways related to demographics. So first, I'm showing you the race and ethnicity that survey respondents reported. And you can see that roughly it's a 60-40 split, with around 40% of the sample self-identifying as people of color. And you can see the specific race ethnic groups that people identified with as people of color in the blue bar. And then around 60% of respondents were white, which is this umber color that we use. And so again, given that these are different surveys, different samples, 3 years apart, it was remarkable to us that there was so much similarity in the composition of the respondents. We also saw a lot of similarity in terms of the gender breakdown and sexuality. So in both years, around 80% of the sample self-identified as women, and around 20% of the sample self-identified as LGBTQ. We did add a new survey question in 2019 about whether people reported that they had a disability. This is obviously something that people could disclose or not. And across all the respondents, around 10% reported having a disability. And then you can see that mental health disorder was the disability that was most likely to be reported. The big change in terms of the demographics of who filled out the survey was in the composition by age and generation. And so we went from around 40% of the sample in 2016 being, having birth years that would place them in the millennial generation, to almost half in 2019. And this reflects both, some changes that have been happening in the sector that have made, according to the Pew Research Center, millennials becoming the largest share of the US workforce currently. And so it was good that our data set was reflecting that as well. So I'm gonna move on to reviewing some of the key findings that are outlined in our report, Race to Lead Revisited. And so just to run through them, the first one was that the findings from the original report were still relevant. The second finding was new ways of looking at the data that demonstrated how clear the white advantage is in the nonprofit sector. And then the third, and this was because of the new questions that we added in 2019, the ability to really get under some of the DEI initiatives that organizations are putting in place to understand how people are viewing them in terms of their effectiveness. So starting with the first of the key findings, so this notion that in general, the story was pretty similar in terms of the racial barriers that people of color were experiencing or reporting related to opportunities for advancement in the nonprofit sector. Unfortunately, we weren't seeing changes over the 3-year period in terms of positive changes. And then where there were changes, in some cases, as I'll show you, the negative experiences are more dominant, actually. So the first thing is that one of the key findings from 2016 was that our data really was able to demonstrate that some of the excuses that we have heard in the nonprofit sector that were meant to explain the racial leadership gap in the sector were just false, right? So one of those excuses that we have been hearing was that, well, people of color don't want to take on these crazy executive director jobs. And I want to acknowledge that being a nonprofit ED often is a crazy making experience, but still people of color do aspire to that level of leadership in the nonprofit sector. And so when we asked people who were not already EDs whether they aspired to top level leadership in the sector, in 2016, half of people of color said definitely or probably yes. And in 2019, that increased slightly to 52%. At the same time, the interest in top level leadership for white respondents decreased a little bit, as you can see. So this gap then widened a little bit between people of color and white respondents in 2019. Now, despite the interest, people of color report real barriers to their advancement, particularly related to their own race. And so the way we ask this question in the survey is we ask about a variety of factors and whether those factors from the person's view have had a very negative, slightly negative, no impact, slightly positive, or very positive impact on their career advancement. And so in 2016, 7% of people of color reported that their race had had a very negative impact on their career advancement, and 28% of people of color reported that their race had had a slightly negative impact on their career advancement. But in 2019, both numbers increased, such that 10% of people of color in 2019 said that their race had a very negative impact on their career advancement, and 39% of people of color reported that their race had a slightly negative impact on their career advancement. And so that then means that we went from roughly a third of people of color reporting that their race was negatively impacting their advancement to roughly half of people of color reporting that their race had negatively impacted their career advancement. And there are a few possibilities in terms of how we can understand this shift in the data, because it is large. One is that the negative experiences have continued, and I think that that is absolutely the case. I think the other thing is that the data in 2016 provided both permission and a framework for people understanding their experiences differently. Because I think what has sometimes happened for people of color is we are not sure what's going on, right? Like, did I not get that opportunity because of my race? And the sort of questioning and uncertainty is a part of the problem. And I think that when the research came out in 2016, 2017, it started a conversation where people of color were being more direct and explicit about the negative experiences that they'd been having in the nonprofit sector. And I think it then gave permission, but also it gave a framework for people reconsidering experiences that they may have thought were nuanced or were not clear cut. And I think that people have sort of reevaluated past experiences and recognized the negative impact of racism on their careers. In addition, as you can see on the right side of this slide, we also saw that white respondents were increasing their recognition of white privilege in the nonprofit sector. So half of white respondents in 2016 recognized that their race had had a slightly positive or very positive impact on their career advancement. And that had increased to 2/3 of white respondents in 2019, which, recognition of white privilege is a positive thing. But again, we're seeing that this is about people, I think discussions, critical conversations, shifting people's perspective and understanding of these social forces and how they're impacting their lives. Here's one of the write-in responses from a survey respondent about the impact of being the one and only, right? And this is both about being Latina in a white and male circle in the nonprofit sector, and the danger of this sort of calculus that people are constantly trying to think through around, do I need to hold back so as to not be labeled, or can I actually be strategic and stand up for myself and my community? We also asked about some other challenges and frustrations. And you can see here that in 2016 and 2019, everyone's stressed out. Like the workload of working in the nonprofit sector is significant. And there's not much of a race gap on that measure. But we do see these racial gaps increasing when you compare the data from 2016 and 2019, such that a larger share of people of color feel like their salaries are inadequate compared to white respondents. A larger share of people of color feel that they have few opportunities for advancement compared to white respondents. And a larger share of people of color are frustrated with lack of role models, again, compared to white respondents. And so these gaps were all bigger in 2019 than the gaps we observed in 2016. Now, it wasn't all bad news. We did have some write-in responses about the importance and the support that people of color have received in the nonprofit sector. And I think it's important to lift this up because the kind of racial matching and support that is provided, particularly from older leaders of color to younger aspiring leaders, is really important. And as a sector, we have to really think through how to support and cultivate that kind of mentorship and support to happen, because I think often it does happen organically, but it also creates an additional burden on the part of leaders of color in the sector to not just run their organizations, but also mentor, cultivate, and support people of color who may not be working for them, but are just in the sector. So moving on to the second finding related to what we call the white advantage. So the data that we collected showed that there is a white advantage in a variety of ways, and I'm going to start out by focusing on the whiteness of organizations. And so we asked survey respondents about the racial composition of their organization at various levels. And so you can see first, respondents to the survey overwhelmingly said that their boards of directors are less than 25% people of color, meaning over 75% of most respondents' boards are white. Similar finding related to what people reported to us in terms of the staff in top leadership roles of their organizations. But then things become much more diverse or distributed, as we would say, around when it comes to staff not in top leadership roles. And then constituents and communities served is weighted towards people of color, right? And so this really shows the mismatch between who holds power and leadership roles, both at the level of board and senior leadership staff roles, compared to line staff and the constituents and community served. And we have another write-in response here about the, again, the challenge of being the one or only in a room, the experience of isolation, frustration, and that it has impacts not just on the personal experience, but on the running of the organization. I think nonprofit organizations that fall into these categories of being more white-led or more white-dominant should really consider both the personal impact on their staff as well as how it impacts the running of the organization, the kind of work that the organization does in community, and the stances that the organization takes on issues. So first, just to explain some of these new categories that we created, we decided to look at the data based on whether what we would call a white-run organization, which is an organization where both the board and senior staff are more than 75% white. Then there was this other category of POC-led, where respondents reported that their organization's board and senior leadership was over half people of color. And then we have this middle category, which was all other. But so what we're really doing is the comparison between white-run and POC-led organizations. And you can see that 45% of respondents reported that their organization was what we would then categorize as a white-run organization, compared to only 14% of respondents working for POC-led groups. But what was interesting was how different the workplace experience was based on looking at the data in this way. And so I'm going to show you 3 key questions that we asked about people's workplace experience and show you how the racial gap is large for people working for white-run organizations, but the racial gap largely disappears for people working for POC-led organizations, and both people of color and white respondents working for POC-led organizations reported more positive experience in their organizations than those working for white-run organizations. So I'm going to go question by question. So the first one was they'd be happy if they worked at the organization 3 years from now. And respondents responded to this question with 1 was that they completely disagreed, 10 was that they completely agreed. And so you can see for respondents who work for white-run organizations, people of color rated their organizations at a 5.4, which you could think of as a 54% out of 100%, compared to white respondents working for white-run organizations, which was a 7.1. And then if you go down, the gap is narrower for people working for that middle category of all others. 6.6 was the rating for people of color, 7.7 was the rating for white respondents. And then there's no gap at all for people working for POC-led organizations at 7.5. Same pattern happens when we asked whether they feel they have a voice in their organization. So people of color working for white-run organizations, much less likely to feel that they have a voice in their organization compared to white respondents working for white-run organizations. And then again, gap is narrower for all other, and gap is even narrower for respondents working for POC-led organizations. And this is actually a case where we see people of color have a slightly higher rating than white respondents. Then the last one, my organization offers fair and equitable opportunities for advancement and promotion. Again, we're seeing larger gap and lower ratings for respondents working for white-run organizations compared to all other, compared to POC-led groups. And so here's another write-in response just to bring in some of the lived experience around the experience of not being taken seriously as a young woman of color in this organization, in a majority white organization, and then also being used as a token brown person, and the experience of tokenization, the real frustration around that. So moving on to the third major finding was just that although DEI initiatives had become commonplace, the experience or the impact of those interventions was pretty mixed. And so I think it's something for organizations and the sector overall to think through, like, what is going to be really impactful in terms of changing the course for organizations in the sector. So we asked respondents what kind of DEI strategies their organizations were pursuing. And as you saw in the earlier slide, 3/4 of respondents said that their organizations were doing something. And these were the top 4 strategies that respondents reported: providing training, making sure that DEI is a part of the mission statement, addressing the ways that racial inequality is a root cause of the issues the organization works on, and then increasing representation in decision-making committees. And you can also, though, see that there are some gaps in terms of between people of color and whites in terms of the frequency that they reported their organization was doing this. Because training was one of the top things, we were able to dig into some of the training topics that people reported their organization was focusing on. And so you can see the top training topics were understanding terms, training on implicit bias, training on structural racism, training on white privilege. But then there was less reported training on recruitment, and then even less reported training on racial trauma, healing, those sorts of things. What was also interesting was that we asked respondents whether they felt that the training was having a positive impact or not. And what the 2 sets of circles show is that when respondents reported that their organization had only trained on 3 or fewer topics, they were less likely to report that the impact of trainings was positive. Whereas if respondents reported that their organization had done training on 4 or more topics, they were much more likely to say that the impact of training was very positive. And what I think this points to is the importance of organizations not doing race equity training or DEI training in a one-off manner, right? Sort of one and done has been the way that people experience these DEI initiatives, that it's like a checkbox It happens once a year in a very perfunctory way. And I think that for organizations that do more intentional and in-depth and sustained training initiatives on multiple facets of DEI and race equity, that those trainings are more impactful and staff experience them as more impactful. And so it's just important to think through, like, what is the training process and methodology that your organization is going to take on. And so we did have a good positive responses around the impact of DEI efforts. So we do know that things can happen, but as this person says, it takes funding, right? But it also takes patience, diplomacy, anger, and persistence. And so this is partially about organizations themselves. It's also partially about the sector broadly in terms of our funders willing to invest in organizations building their capacity and competency to do more race equity, to become more racially equitable and inclusive workplaces. Important also to acknowledge that DEI is also fundamentally often about policy, right? And so we asked whether people, again, looking at it in the same way, whether people believe that their organization or agreed that their organization has policies and procedures in place to ensure DEI, whether the leadership consistently demonstrates the commitment to it, and whether the organization takes a public stand on the root causes of issues. And the same pattern happened where the ratings were lower for respondents working for white-run organizations, and we see bigger racial gaps. The gaps get narrower, and the ratings go up as we go from white-run to all other to then POC-led organizations. All right, and so then wrapping up, just want to acknowledge that there are various and differing perceptions on issues of race equity in the nonprofit sector. And so the big gap was one of these new question that we added in 2019, where we asked respondents whether they agreed with this statement. We know how to improve diversity, equity, inclusion in the nonprofit sector, but decision makers don't have the will to make change. That was something that we started hearing over and over again from presentations that we were doing in focus groups. So we just wanted to test like whether people agreed with that sentiment. And almost 3/4 of people of color agreed with that sentiment compared to only half of white respondents. So that was where we saw a particularly large racial gap. And so it's just important for organizations to think through how are decision makers demonstrating? Well, first, do decision makers fundamentally believe, but then how then do they also demonstrate a real commitment to make change? And so here's a quote related to that piece around actually making change. And this is someone who's saying that changing minds is important, but also a slow and unpredictable process. And so how can we be thinking about changing people's behaviors? And so related to changing behaviors and some of the sectoral strategies for change, there's clear consensus that it is important for white leaders in the sector to advocate for race equity and against bias, that we do need leadership development programs for people of color, that also we need philanthropy to increase funding to people of color-led organizations. And this was one place where we were seeing a racial gap, with people of color agreeing more with that than white respondents. Again, maybe not surprising given that people think, well, if POC-led organizations are getting more funding, then our organization will get less. That it's important to actually be diversifying the composition of boards since they have decision-making authority and power. And we need stronger anti-discrimination laws. This was one where there was less agreement and support, but still worth lifting up, because we think that systemic issues really do need to be factored in, that it can't just all be about individual practices of organizations. So just gonna wrap up with some of the recommendations from the Race to Lead report. We think it's important to pay attention to the experiences of people of color in the workplace. We think that it's important to ensure that organizational policies reflect a real commitment and that organizations are acting on those policies consistently. We want to push funders to change their own practices so that organizations led by people of color get the resources they need. And we think that for organizations that are trying to make change, setting real goals and then making sure that the organization's leadership is more reflective of the demographics of the population served, so that we start reducing that mismatch between who holds power in organizations and who the organizations are serving. And then the organizations that are taking on DEI efforts be transparent about their progress and be willing to establish ongoing goals and be transparent about course corrections along the way. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll move into the panel discussion. Hold on one second.
Thank you so much, Sean. And there were two questions in the chat, which I will get answered personally to the people who asked them. Those are questions that I can answer and I will answer and get that information back.
Great.
And now we are going to go into a panel discussion with Sean and our four leaders of color to really discuss their personal experiences and their journey to leadership. So, again, please mute yourselves and put it on speaker view, I recommend, and let's begin.
Great. And so we wanted to start out just with having each of the panelists, just identify yourself in terms of, let's say, name, pronoun, and your organization, just so we can hear from everyone first, and then I'll move into the questions posing. Karen, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Karen Cheeks-Lomax. I am the CEO at my sister's place here in Westchester, and my pronouns are her and hers.
Wonderful. Maria, do you want to go next? You're still on mute.
I'm Maria Imperial. I'm the CEO of the YWCA White Plains and Central Westchester, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Thanks. Damon.
Thank you. Good morning. Dr. Damon Kelly, President and CEO of Lutheran Social Services of New York. Pronouns he, him, and his.
All right, and Theo.
Hi, everyone. Theo Oshiro, currently Deputy Director at Make the Road New York. I'll be incoming Co-Executive Director as of April 1st. So happy to be here. My pronouns are he, him, and él.
All right, wonderful. And so the first question that I'm posing to the four of you relates to, how does what I presented from like the national perspective in terms of the data resonate with your own lived experience? And Damon, can I have you start us off, especially since you have also done research on this topic in New York? Can you just start us off with your reactions and how the data and national research reflects and connects to your own experience and what you've also seen from your other research?
Thank you, Sean. So yes, I mean, it truly resonates with me. The data that you shared is consistent with the findings of my doctoral research, which in particular focused on Black males and the lack of Black males in leadership positions in the nonprofit sector. And I think when Jan started, she hit it off, or somebody else had mentioned, the fact that the nonprofit sector thinks because they do work on behalf of the people that there isn't a struggle with race and leadership issues. And that's absolutely false. You know, one of the things that your research has shown and my research has shown also is that it's truly the racial makeup of the board of directors which impacts who's hired as the CEO of the organization. And one of the things that we have to be very mindful of is that the human service sector is one that was created not out of equity, but one that was created, the original settlement houses were created to Americanize Eastern European immigrants who came to this country. So it's really never been about helping people. It's been about acclimation. And all these years later, we're still suffering from some of those issues.
Mhm.
Thanks so much, Damon. Maria, how about you? How does the national data confirm or challenge or differ from your own experience?
The national data is spot on for me. And I remember vividly reading the original Race to Lead results and getting very emotional as I was reading it, even now feeling like I'm getting emotional talking about this, because I felt like it mirrored my experience almost so exactly. And it wasn't earth-shattering news. I was aware of all of this, but it was just very reassuring to see that I wasn't the crazy one, because so many times at least I feel like, oh gosh, I must be the crazy one, and I knew I am not the crazy one. This is what's going on in the industry, and this was definitely my experience on the pathway to becoming a CEO.
And Karen, I'm wondering if you have any observations about how the sector locally is unique or distinctive, and also sort of how your own experiences, what your experiences have been given, the demographics, the way power operates here in Westchester.
So first, thanks. I'm happy to be here. And when we talk about this information resonating, as Damon and Maria said, when I first read it in 2016, I sent it to my board because I wanted them to understand that this was real, that it wasn't Karen's issue, that Karen hadn't made this up, that we needed to move our organization in a different way. And so, as we know, there's resistance. I think Anna Haita said it perfectly in the beginning. There's resistance when we're asking for change and when we're putting facts and historical concepts in front of whiteness, right? And so that was one of the things that I began doing historically, not almost a decade before that, had always been working on a grassroots level. But then in 2016, when we did our strategic plan, we made it almost official. I said that we needed to look at race and racism. The nonprofit sector here is pretty much what you described, Sean, in your experiences of people, this national survey. We're not different. We all believe that we're doing, I think Damon really coined it. We all think we're doing, this great work, but the underpinnings of race and racism live in, philanthropic perspectives, and it lives in, nonprofit environments. And what I so appreciate about what you've done here, what we've all done here, is we've begun to look at this issue and to dismantle it, but now having conversations that really talk about the realities and the sad truths of race and racism and the construct that we've all lived by, that has been, very difficult and challenging for everyone, both white and Black.
Theo, I want to bring you in also, especially because Make the Road is, not an organization that sort of centers whiteness or would be considered a white dominant organization. And so can you talk about how both your organization is structured in ways that may be different from the picture that was painted through the data, but also what impact that has in terms of both your experience as a leader, but also the experience of community members who come to the organization for support and help.
Sure, Sean, and thank you so much for all of your work over the years on this amazing survey and all of the data. I think it is just super helpful. I think for our field to shed light on our work, right, and how much more work we have yet to do And thank you, Jan, for bringing us all together and for the board. There's 128 participants on right now, and I think that says a lot about how much this issue matters to us all and how much we want to do something to improve, I think the race, right, in our lives and in our organizations and our society, and all the dynamics. Many of the things that were in the survey absolutely resonated. I think you're right that Make the Road New York, right, we are a membership-led organization. We do community organizing as really one of the predominant kind of areas of work, which just in itself calls for an approach that is very much about leadership development around putting impacted people up front, and having them lead the work. I think the fact that we are a membership-based organization definitely has allowed us to really center race as a predominant thing to focus on as we're focusing on our campaigns. I'll say a little bit more because I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, because I think despite our structure, despite how we're set up, we have faced real issues, which I do want to talk about. But other things like the structure of our board. Our board is a majority community member board. So essentially, folks from our communities, elected from our organizing committees, make up the majority of our board. And so at the very highest level, we have a diverse constituency, right, helping to run our organization, which I think has really done a lot for us, right, to put the concerns of impacted community members out front, as we have also our members leading on the campaigns. We also provide direct services, right, across the organization, in addition to our organizing. And I think we've also faced, we've absolutely prioritized over time recruiting and hiring people of color to key positions, and have faced also challenges, right? We have a legal department that provides legal services, and the lack of a real pipeline to legal careers, for our community members, for people of color, is real, right? And we've encountered that in our ability to hire people of color into those kinds of positions. So, my own personal experience, I think, is one of, I started at Make the Road in 2015 as a health advocate. And, after having grown up in New York City as an immigrant from Peru, and I think my own personal experience in navigating, this new country with my family, translating for them, and living in fear and isolation, most of the time, was a very real experience that I brought to my work and to what I wanted to do with my life. And Make the Road has been an amazing place to be able to develop my leadership, and get to where I am today. That said, I think that there exists still a lot of obstacles and a lot of challenges. I mentioned the legal pipeline. There are many others that I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about, but I just wanted to start there.
Thanks so much, Theo. And, on this point about leadership development and the opportunities to develop as leaders, Karen and Maria, I'm curious, particularly as women of color, if you have any reflections about the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender in terms of your own paths to being in leadership roles, because despite the fact that the nonprofit sector is a sector where there are a lot of women in leadership roles, we also know that the data shows that men tend to run the largest organizations with the largest budgets. And so just want to acknowledge the intersectionality, and I wonder if you have any thoughts or experiences related to that in terms of your own paths and advancement.
Well, I have a story that I usually share about how my first invitation, if you will, to join senior management or to become a deputy director. And It happened when I was the general counsel at Safe Horizon in New York City, and the deputy director, who was a man, was leaving. So there was a void, and the executive director was thinking about how to restructure or who would become the deputy director. So she decided to promote 3 people. So she promoted me and 2 white men to be the co-deputy directors. And the day after she made this announcement, I was also the community person, which is not, which everybody, which is very familiar to a lot of women of color, especially that I was at a victim services organization. So I was very, very active in the community, and I had been the general counsel. So the day after, the 2 men said to me, "Oh, I wonder why she picked 3 people. This is really out of the ordinary. Most people would pick 2 people, but I think she picked 2. I think she picked 3 people because she wanted to add a little color at the top." And I was like looking at them like, what are you talking about? And the thing I remember too was the other man, the bystander, said, "Maria, come on, you have to admit it." She said, "Don't you think it's odd that there's 3 of us?" And so then I looked at them and I said to them, "The 2 of you really," I mean, the Bronx came out on me, and I said, "The 2 of you really have cojones. I have a master's in management of not-for-profits. I have a law degree from Harvard Law School. I'm the community person. And I also got my job at that time through the New York Times. I mean, I didn't know anyone at the organization, and I applied there was a posting. Everyone else at that organization had their job because they were friends of friends. So I said, there is affirmative action going on here, but it's not for me. So that was the way I was welcomed to becoming a leader at a not-for-profit. And I mean, that story has many iterations throughout my career. So that's just the personal, and I do think, I mean, that was early in my career, but the stories continue, and the differential treatment, and always feeling like you have to prove yourself too.
Thanks for sharing, Maria. Karen, thoughts on your end?
Sure. I think having to prove yourself is one of the primary issues that certainly women of color experience. Certainly as a Black woman, I experienced right away. I think that, prior to coming to my sister's place, I worked for Legal Services in Harlem, which was essentially a Black-led organization, which was a very different nonprofit experience. But coming here, the board at the time was probably 80, maybe 90% white. The senior leadership did not reflect any diversity except me as the new CEO. And it's just challenging to be in that space. It's challenging to be alone. It's isolating, it's frustrating, you feel angry when people, speak to you in ways that they see as welcoming. But, deep down inside you understand, some of the micro and macro aggressions that are kind of framed in that nice, conversation. I think that the challenge, because there's no roadmap, but I think, Sean, we've put together a roadmap by you doing the work that you've been doing. We're starting to see that next generation, those millennials that you talked about, who are now taking it out into the street. The conversations are different. 18 years ago when I was coming into my sister's place, I was alone. And I and felt very isolated, but I think now we're starting to have these very profound conversations that if we don't have the nonprofit organizations that exist here in Westchester and other places, they have no value. Because if we're not taking the people who work for us seriously, We're at my sister's place, we're looking at the about 79% of our staff are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And if we're not looking at those individuals and we're not looking outside of ourselves and looking into our communities and looking at what transpired this summer, but beyond this summer, people of color know that this summer was just this summer, right? But when you talk about 450 years of race and racism, and where do you begin? You have to start to say, as organizations, we're going to look outside of ourselves, and we will embrace change. I think, and I'll say this quickly, one of the things that you talk about, Sean, in your research is when organizations say, hey, we're going to do training, we're going to do diversity and inclusion, and you point out that it is a check-off box. If you're not invested, we've been doing really probably for the last decade, training with the People's Institute, and now we're working with a consultant who is working with our teams and our board. Our board has to understand the historical context of race and racism, how it all plays out in our organization and our staff as well. And I just think that, as we move forward, we have to bring everybody along. We're all at different places, but we have to bring everyone along so that there will be other leaders that look like me. And that's what I do at my sister's place. Every manager knows what I'm thinking. Every manager knows that as we hire people, that I want to know who's coming in. What are those credentials? Who are these people that are coming in? Back in the day, people just hired whoever they wanted to hire, and there was never an opportunity to make change or to hear a diversity of voices in our space. A lot of work.
Thanks so much, Karen. Yeah, and staying on this theme of what change is needed and what it takes to actually make organizational change, Damon, I just want to turn it over to you for any additional thoughts that you have about strategies, practices for making organizational change. You identified that a big either enabler or barrier to change can be boards of directors, since they often ultimately have the power to hire and fire the executive leader. I'm curious if you have any experiences around change with the board, either to bring the board along or to change the composition of the board so that there will be more support for the kind of both leadership but also strategies that you wanted to pursue as a leader.
Sure. So thank you. So one of the challenges you always hear from the board of directors is that, oh, we can't find anybody, or there isn't anyone who's qualified. And really, that's just a lame excuse. I mean, there are so many professional organizations that are composed of people of color who would be more than willing to serve on boards of directors. I think also it's important for executive directors, CEOs, whether you're white or a person of color, to really have conversations with your boards about this issue of racial justice and racial equity. I look at Lutheran Social Services, and my team always hears me speak about the fact that we're one of the largest organizations in New York City that has such a diverse executive and leadership staff. Our entire executive staff is composed of people of color. The majority of our leadership staff are individuals of color. And, would that have occurred if there was a white CEO at the top? And so we've endeavored to really continue the diversification of our staff, as well as to diversify the board. There are too many people of color who are well qualified to hear any board say that they cannot find qualified people. The problem, though, is that most board members come to a board through a social connection. About 80% of individuals who come to those boards because they're connected to somebody else on that board. So if your board is composed of mostly white males, for example, they tend to recruit other white males who they know to serve on the board. Those individuals have to step out of their comfort zone and seek board members who are different from them. And, part of the challenge, because of the way the sector is designed, we use the excuse that, we need to recruit board members who have money. Well, that's something that's got to change too. We've got to change the dynamic where government does not provide enough funding to pay for the true cost of our programs, and thus we're forced to find individuals who could make up that difference. One of the things I constantly say is that the 501c3 is our tax status and not our business model. And we exist in a sector that is focused on dollars. And if you look at the contributions of the sector to the economy, we're a sector that it has revenues of over $1.75 trillion. It's a sector that employs almost 10% of the people in the United States. So not only is this about race, but it's also about economics, and we've got to understand that.
Thanks so much. And Theo, I want to bring it back to you in terms of some of the, despite Make the Road being an organization where majority of members and leadership are people of color, you identified that there are still needs for training, and that that your organization is not some utopian or ultimately just idealized place. Can you just talk a little bit about what it looks like to still push that kind of organization that's probably ahead of where many other organizations are, to be still more inclusive, still more equitable as an organization, as a workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think your report highlights is just the amount of work and proactive work and continual work that we need to do just all the time, right? To make sure that racial equity, racial justice is centered in our work and in all of our decisions. Back in 2016, Make the Road embarked on a strategic plan. And many of you, I'm sure, have had experiences with strategic plans where, they're predominantly often kind of just a process so that you can say you did it and you give it to a funder or something like that. But in 2016, we really decided to be intentional and real about a strategic plan that not only was real, but that also centered race as part of everything that we were going to look at as we were thinking about our strategy for the next 5 years. I mentioned a little bit about my history, and of course, as part of the strategic plan, there was a lot of listening that we had to do from our staff. And I reference my history because when I went to Make the Road, to me, it seemed like a utopia, right? Because I was a Latino immigrant who was coming into this place that had a lot of other Latino immigrants, a lot of other brown people around me in our membership and our staff. But what we heard loud and clear during our strategic planning process was from our Black youth who felt invisible in our organization, who felt that they were not at the center of our work and our campaigns. And I honestly, and I think naively, was taken aback by that, right? Because I thought, well, I'm a person of color, right? This place is great. And it took work for me to really realize that is my experience as the person I am, as a man, as a Latino immigrant, and not as a Black youth in Bushwick. And so what we did when we heard loud and clear from our membership and some of our membership and staff that they did not see themselves in our organization, we made it very real in our strategic plan to put our Black youth front and center, not only in our campaign work, right, where we did. We started to really think about what are unifying campaigns that aren't just about immigrant communities or just about LGBTQ communities, but what are campaigns that we can all embark on and that impact our Black youth. And so we ended up really focusing on a campaign to target private prisons and immigrant detention centers, which I think resonated across the board with all of the folks that are part of our organization. And then we also saw that we had a lot more work to do to increasingly put people of color in leadership of our staff. And so we set goals, which, you know, I'm happy to report we were able to achieve, of getting to 80% of our staff people of color, and 70% of our staff leadership and people of color, and now all of our incoming executive directors are people of color. So, you know, I think for us, it's taken a lot of effort. We still have a lot more way to go. We are doing, you know, we've put together a DEI committee. We've allocated funding to make sure that we're able to hire a full-time DEI staff member to move us forward. Because as I said, like this issue cannot be something that someone does as 10% of their work. It has to be, you know, we have to think about it as what it is, actual work that needs to be advanced daily, that is extremely complex, and that needs to have someone skilled in bringing together a whole organization at every level.
Thanks so much, Theo. And before we move into the facilitated discussion, I just wanted to invite Maria to talk a little bit more about both change at the level of organizations, but also sectoral, and the YWCA's investment in really focusing on racial justice for, you know, as an organization, but also for, you know, the rest of the sector here in Westchester.
Sure. I feel very proud that the YWCA's mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. And it's funny, when I first came to the YWCA, I remember a funder asked me in New York City, how could you be going to the YWCA? That's such a broad mission. It's 2 missions. And it's really not 2 missions. It's 1 mission of empowering women, but realizing the intersectionalities that impact women, that unless we address racism, not all women would be free. And so the YWCA realized that, you know, in the 1940s, which is really incredible. And so nowadays, I think most not-for-profits would be, if it's like, if you're an education organization, your mission will be educating children and eliminating racism. So I feel like eliminating racism now, it should be part of everybody's mission. And we also have work to do at the YWCA. One issue that I think was very helpful to me, and I'm just mentioning this because I think it's very important, and I know it changed my experience at the YWCA, was having a board president who was a Black woman. And that's why I went to the YWCA, for the opportunity to work with her. So I think that we do have to focus on, again, trying to elevate women at all different levels. We also didn't talk about philanthropy. Philanthropy also plays a part in here, in terms of which foundations are willing to support organizations led by people of color. So we all have a lot of work cut out for us.
Thanks so much. And so Jan is showing the slide with the, the questions that we are posing for the facilitated conversation. So the idea is that we're going to get into small groups. Jan, anything else you want to say before the breakout rooms open up?
Yeah, so nobody has to do anything. You're going to be automatically put into rooms and then taken out. We have about 20 minutes to have a conversation and then come back and report on them. We have our panelists and 3 others facilitating this, but if somebody could volunteer to note take and report back, that would be great. This is going to be the start of our action. And based on what we learn today from all of you and what else is needed, we are going to, as a community and as a sector, begin to move forward. And so, you know, this is not a one and done. And now we are going to go into those facilitated conversations with the following questions. there we see everyone. Welcome back, everyone. We're starting to all come back into the main section. I do see some smiling faces, so I hope that was okay.
It's because I get to see you, Jan. That's why.
Aw, thanks. So Suzanne, will you tell me when everyone's back? Oh, I think I could see on the screen from the number of participants. So welcome back, everyone, as you're coming in. I'm going to, first of all, reiterate that this is the start of a process. We're all going to hopefully come back together again and have more of an action plan. So we're still just waiting for a few to come back in. And Suzanne, maybe you can tell me when we're all set. We may have a few people drop off as well.
I believe all the rooms are closed,
Great.
so no one should be in their rooms by themselves anymore, right?
So what I'm going to do is we're going to start asking for feedback. And so I know, I'm not sure if you remember the number of your breakout room. I guess we should have said that to remember your number, but we'll be nimble here. So the breakout room that was headed by Jeanette Gisbert, is there a spokesperson for that room? And can you take just a couple of minutes and report back? I think we have about 7 or 8 rooms. So just about 2 minutes, please, to let us know what happened in your room. And just before we begin, again, I want to thank all of you, and I want to a really, really special thank you to our panelists for putting so much work into this. So Jeanette Gisbert's room, if you could report, please, and just.
Hi, I volunteered to record and report, and we had a very courageous conversation internally in the room, and where some of the members of the room shared their personal experience as leaders of color, and sharing what that felt like and what we can do, acknowledging the fact that that the study just reinforced what we've already known within our own organizations or our life experiences. There was, what we discussed was the importance of being aware, those who are leaders, white leaders of organizations, being aware of your own power based on your own race, and taking a look at ourselves and having liberated conversations, continued proactive conversations, aware of our own privilege if you are not a person of color, and being more supportive of leaders of color, both on the board and within the leadership of an organization.
Thank you, Shirley.
Tried to summarize.
Ariana's group, who is your spokesperson?
We actually didn't decide one, so that's gonna be me. And I'll keep it brief, as you know I do. The presentation and all the conversations resonated deeply with everyone, right? We talked. It seems especially the piece about the board was a piece that really spoke to folks and really made folks think about action. But something that kind of came up throughout it all as we think about introspection, self-reflection, it seems a lot of kind of deep individual things, but also thinking about how we build relationships so that we also know how to take action. One piece I wanted to highlight was just in general, as we have this conversation and some folks recognize it, is that when we talk about solving the issue, it isn't just about getting people into the room, right? And we have to talk about support. And as Theo mentioned, right, he talks about it's not just about noticing the problem, it's actually providing that support and for providing space for people to flourish and actually succeed. So that's something that I want us to think about, and I think came out of the core of our brief conversation, is that it's not just enough to get people, right? And it's not enough to just pull them in and put them at the table and say, hey, look at us, let's publish a new brochure. It's about saying, all right, we have folks here. How do we support them? How do we learn how to be supportive? And how do we learn to really change our actions so that we're actually thriving instead of continuing to do the problem? So that's kind of as brief as I can keep it.
Right. And that's what we've heard also reminds me that you can have diversity, but you don't necessarily have inclusion or equity. So you can have as diverse of an organization as you want, but unless people have a place at the table and their voices are heard and acted upon, then you're just diverse without anything else. So I think that was an important point. Thank you, Ariana and group. Kim, your group spokesperson?
That was Danielle. And you're muted, Danielle.
Talking to myself here. I'm such a wonderful audience. Thank you all. So I took some notes quickly from the conversation we had in our room. And I think one fundamental piece, although it's hard perhaps not to get discouraged, is that we're moving forward. It takes time. These are difficult conversations that evolve. And so how do we support that process along the way? But to be grounded in understanding the true history behind it will help. It helps move that conversation along. But these are effective through personal stories, through an understanding of history, but also I think this understanding that it's not going to happen overnight. Two other key pieces I think that we talked about was we're starting to make some of these, general broad understandings of change, but then how tactically do you do that? How tactically do you, come up with a better recruitment and training model that helps support it from a staff level and then from a board level? And then one point which I didn't get a chance to raise with the group, but I think is fundamental to a conversation here is, the big, and I think that was raised by Damon Kelly is, how are we funded? And is there a way actually to come up with a different model for funding us? Some organizations run as almost like a pure business, and they're more of a consumer client related, and very much other ones are government funded. But how does that structure itself really impact the way that we're able to have these other effective conversations? And I think that's a big part of who we are and a big part of what's creating boundaries within these conversations.
Thank you so much. Okay, Sean's group.
Sure. So our group talked a fair amount about some of the pipeline challenges. The challenge in terms of identifying board members. And so there was a fair amount of conversation about different models for that, as well as different programs that may be available to do some intentional matching of more people of color with the interest and skills to be board members with organizations that are looking for board members. Another pipeline challenge that was identified was, unfortunately, organizations have, with limited budgets, have identified talented staff of color, but not been able to provide the salaries that would be competitive and be able to actually bring people into their organization. So that was another one. And then for organizations that do have a stronger bench of leaders of color in the sort of the pipeline, also doing the work with the board to then recognize the talent and capacity of the people who are in that bench so that they are looking to cultivate and support people who are coming up through the organization, as opposed to immediately looking outside of the organization for the next leader.
Thank you. And we have just about a little under 2 minutes for the remaining speakers. Karen's group.
Hey everybody, that's me, Gina Martinez at the Community Resource Center. Our group talked about what resonated for us. We talked about first accountability. What are we doing to look within ourselves and our organizations to change the fabric of our staff and our board? but also opening up space for people of color in those positions. It's important to open up space for those people. And so in order to do that, we have to have intentional recruitment and really look outside in associations or even our own nonprofit sector. With Nonprofit Westchester, there are a lot of partner organizations that we could be actively and intentionally recruiting from in order to put people of color in those leadership positions. But then once we get there, once we do have POC people in these leadership positions, how are they seeking mentorship opportunities? How are we giving them mentorship opportunities? Maybe they're the first one in that position and are feeling alone and need support. So members of our group are also saying, how do I also become a member for people who are the first ones in that position? And also importantly, once organizations make this active change, again, as Jan said, it can't just be you're diverse and that's it. You have to also be diverse and inclusion and include people and have an equitable approach to their leadership. So that means trusting them, having confidence in them. And I mentioned, just from my perspective, we're coming from a different educational background, a different socioeconomic background, but trust that because that is going to change the way that your organization leads their community. So yeah, that's what we discussed.
And I might add also, when recruiting, be very cognizant of the lens that you're using and the biases that you bring in. If white people are hiring, they're not necessarily using a lens that is equitable to people of color. Maria, your group is up next.
Hi, so I'm reporting for our group. With regard to the report, everybody felt that the information wasn't necessarily surprising, but one aspect that did come up was in terms of the nonprofits that were surveyed, that data, what size are they? Would be kind of interesting to see in terms of that information. With regard to calls to action, the boards and diversifying the boards and the funders was a focus of the conversation. Not only diversifying them, but communication to them and education for boards and funders. And another aspect of that came out if we're trying to attract emerging leaders that are BIPOC or get more funding. What kind of information and data, how should the nonprofit be communicating to these particular groups?
Great, thank you. Theo, your group.
Hi, everyone. Allison Lake. So in the interest of time, we certainly covered, I think, things similar to other groups have reported. Wanted to continue what Patricia said. We all certainly resonated with the report and the data. Many had seen it before, but I do think it would be helpful, any kind of breakdown. And I know that was one of the questions in the chat by, size of organization, budget of organization, because as we get to action plan, I think these are going to be vital for us to sort of find some cohorts that maybe can work together around those pieces. And I guess the other piece that was sort of evident in our conversation is that, everyone is sort of on a different place on this continuum. And some people are starting their journeys. Some have been in it for a long time. And so again, how do we sort of support people where they are and move forward to the action that's needed?
Thank you, Allison. And last but certainly not least, Damon's group.
So we talked about whiteness as a benefit in terms of employment opportunities and other leadership arenas. We also talked about really the importance that having a leader of color or people of color in leadership positions, the impact that has not only on clients, but on staff as well. Particularly those who provide direct services, the hurtful feelings that they experience by believing that their voices were not heard, which is something that was raised in the presentation. We also had examples of the need, both from a legal perspective, the need for having attorneys who look like the client base that you're serving. That's always important from a culture perspective, and just from a racial equity perspective. And then the last thing we talked about was perhaps NPW sponsoring a board recruitment event, sort of like a speed dating program where individuals of color are recruited or engaged to see about their interest in serving on a board. So those were some of the issues we tackled.
Well, thank you so much. In terms of the board recruitment, I will definitely talk to our partner at Volunteer New York, who already does a board speed dating, and see if there's an opportunity to use that model for this suggestion. So we are at 10:30 exactly. Thank you all so much again to our panelists and to Sean. There was so much work that went into this. I'm really, really grateful, and to our facilitators and to all of you. This is not the last time we will be coming together. You will hear from us as we move forward into action. So thank you so much. And I look forward to speaking with all of you again. Take care.